I'm sure you've heard this argument before. It would be great to tax the rich more, but then they'd all just leave. It's a standard argument as to why it's actually a good thing that the 50 richest families in the UK have more wealth than the bottom 50% of families. Yes, that really does mean 50 families have more wealth than 34 million people combined. Anyway, in the service of this argument that we should let the wealthy have more yachts, a story was widely disseminated in the media late last month. So this is from The Standard. Britain on track to lose unprecedented 16,500 millionaires in 2025 amid high taxes and non-dom crackdown. So the argument that even these sort of tepid Labour policies of cracking down on non-doms and moderately raising taxes, which they barely did anyway, that's leading to this exodus of millionaires. Also in The Independent, millionaires to flee UK in record numbers. That 16,500 figure there again. And then in The Telegraph, Britain to lose more millionaires than any other country after tax raid. And I suppose to make this seem more credible, they've converted this into a chart. So you can see the United Kingdom losing 16,500 millionaires and the UAE gaining 9,800. As I say, this exodus was apparently in response to Labour's fairly tepid policies on tax. And the implication presumably would be that should absolutely rule out any more radical proposals for a wealth tax, the kind of tax that Labour haven't even suggested yet. Well, that argument might work, except these figures were not far from completely made up. This was the Financial Times on the weekend. So they say doubt cast on widely quoted millionaire migration numbers. Report published in association with Henley and Partners criticised for use of LinkedIn data and definition of private wealth. Now, the article, or the FT article, I should say, draws on analysis by the Tax Policy Associates think tank, which said the claim was made based on analysis of LinkedIn profiles and was therefore not representative. And notably, the company that did the original analysis, so that led to all of these headlines, barely even stands by the claims itself. So it's called New World Wealth. And this is from the FT article. Andrew Amoyles, the founder and sole employee of South Africa-based NWW, so only got one employee, told the Financial Times there was just a lack of information around, and we've tried to fill the gap as best we could on the migration of rich individuals. Then he says, the fact that it's been so heavily linked to non-doms is a little unfortunate because, to be honest, we don't know whether someone is a non-dom or not, he added. So basically our data's not very good. I'm just one guy anyway, working from my home office in South Africa. As I say, the New World Wealth outfit, that's just one person. But this evidence, or this report, was done in partnership with another organisation. Perhaps they're more credible and more reliable. Well, the FT goes on to say, Amoyles' wealth migration reports are published in association with Henley and Partners, a London-based consultancy that markets schemes selling passports and residency permits in more than 40 countries. So they service the super rich. The report has come under fire from Dan Needle, founder of the Tax Policy Associates think tank, who said that until an independent audit is carried out, the wealth migration report should be treated as marketing material, not evidence. Well, the habit of companies who represent the wealthy putting out questionable data when it comes to wealth taxes was highlighted by Gary Stevenson this week, speaking on the Rest is Politics podcast.
How do you feel when you see this debate that's going on at the moment, which Farage is currently trying to tap into, that the non-doms are all leaving, the super wealthy are all leaving Britain because they're being taxed too much?
I know who funds these analyses. I know it's private wealth funds. Listen, I've been doing this work, so I'm relatively high profile the last 2 years. I've been doing this work in public for 5 years. And for years and years and years, I would go on LBC and talk radio, and I would say we need to tax the rich for free. And I would go up against somebody who works for the IEA and is paid by a billionaire. This is the truth. Listen, you know it as well as I know.
That's the Institute of Economic
There's
Affairs. 2
ways to make money in media. You sell news to the public, or you sell the public to the rich. There's 2 ways to make money in politics. You convince the public, you sell the public to the rich. I know, listen, when I first left trading, the first thing I wanted to do was go to work for a think tank. This is the obvious thing to do. And I went to look for a left-wing think tank because you think these guys are going to be doing work on inequality. I volunteered at a left-wing think tank in London. There was nobody working on inequality. You know why? Because they couldn't get funding for it. So the problem you have here is that the rich are aggressively going to try to prevent any increase on their taxation. When I was writing the book, I was reading Hard Times, Charles Dickens. There's a section in there where they talk about how the rich were saying if the government raises any taxes on them, they're going to take their factories and throw them into the sea. This is 150 years ago.
Amazing anecdote about the Charles Dickens book saying they're going to throw their factories into the sea. Obviously, they said the same thing about the weekend, right? Whenever you propose some kind of policy that's going to harm the rich, they will put a lot of money into think tanks saying it's a terrible idea. Now, that doesn't mean you should say any questions about a wealth tax should be dismissed out of hand as pure propaganda. I'm sure there are lots of sort of technical discussions that need to be had, but we shouldn't buy these arguments wholesale. And unfortunately, someone who doesn't seem to be as critical as Gary when it comes to those proposing or suggesting wealth tax are impossible. Someone who is, I suppose, buying into those arguments is the business secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, who said this to GB News on Friday.
But the idea there's a magic wealth tax, some sort of levy, that doesn't exist anywhere in the world. Switzerland has a levy, but they don't have capital gains or inheritance tax. There's no kind of magic. We're not going to do anything daft like that. And I say to people, be serious about this. The idea you can just levy everyone. What if your wealth chopper was not in your bank account? What was in fine wine or art? How am I going to... How would we tax that? This is why this doesn't exist. And there's a lot of populism out about this. I'm frustrated. To me, I see colleagues sometimes say this in Parliament. I say, come on, get serious.
This is why this doesn't exist. There might be another reason why it doesn't exist, which is that powerful people don't want it to exist. It's not the case that every policy that we don't have because it would be impossible. There's also something called interests in politics. Again, I'm not saying there might not be technical, practical difficulties with a wealth tax. That means we need to think very carefully about it and do it correctly. But to just say, oh, this is daft populism, if it worked, we'd have done it already, I think is not a sensible way for a Labour politician to be doing politics. And someone who disagrees with Jonathan Reynolds is Martin Sandbu. He's the European economics commentator for the Financial Times. He had an article out today or yesterday saying trade and wealth tax myth busting. Know your facts before conventional wisdom gets you. Now, in the article, he lists what he calls 4 myths about wealth taxes. I'm just going to show you the first one. So he says the myth, it's too hard to do, which is basically what Jonathan Reynolds was saying. Practically, it's too difficult. And so Martin Sandbu says, the idea that implementing a net wealth tax is particularly challenging in terms of logistics and governance keeps coming up. Of course, it could be that the UK tax administration is particularly useless. The FT reports that MPs have accused the government of not knowing how much tax billionaires pay. It could also be that the complainers have not bothered to look at how net wealth taxes are implemented in the countries that have them. Switzerland and Norway have 2 of the world's richest, most successful and best governed economies. They both levy net wealth taxes and have been doing so for a very long time. While such a tax may sometimes be politically contested, there is no sign at all that levying it is difficult in purely practical terms. In Norway, for example, property values are automatically assessed based on formulas. Financial companies report bank and investment holdings to the tax authorities, and unlisted companies' stakes are taxed based on their reported accounting values. So in other words, it's a political problem, not a technical one, the opposite of what Jonathan Reynolds was suggesting. Now, you can read the article for the other 3 reasons. As I said, he did 4 myths. I'm also going to try get him on the show, I think. It'd be good to have a Financial Times commentator saying why Jonathan Reynolds is wrong about the wealth tax. For now, though, Rivka, that demand for a wealth tax is getting louder. The pushback against it will also get louder. What do you think of the nature of the debate so far?
Well, profoundly fact-free, I suppose. I think, as Martin Sandbu says in his article, the facts haven't yet got the people that they have that they're supposed to have got. Why is Norway not being discussed, for starters? You know, the fact that Jonathan Reynolds can right out lie and claim that there's nowhere in the world that has such taxes, when in fact 2 years ago Norway introduced them, is absurd to me. You know, GB News is Ofcom regulated. I hope people complained about that glaring factual inaccuracy. I think what's more, as a result of this, the examples of Sweden and Norway, we actually have real data about whether this supposed exodus materializes. You know, after Norway introduced its 1% levy on wealth, there was no so-called exodus. Of the 236,000 millionaires and billionaires who live in Norway, do you know how many left? 30. And how many of them do you think continue to send their children to private schools in Norway and intend to come back within 5 or 10 years to live or to retire in Norway? You know, the idea that there's going to be some great exodus to the UAE is absolutely absurd. If there is, people might enjoy a couple of years of living on yachts and, seeing the police drive around in supercars or whatever they do, and, like gallivanting around air-conditioned malls. But no one's going to want to live in the UAE forever. Like, that sounds like torture, quite frankly. And so I think, we overlook the fact that millionaires and billionaires have been proven not to, flee en masse when wealth taxes are introduced, because they have real ties to the country that they live in. Much like we give asylum seekers the right to live here because they have real ties to the country that they live in. People aren't just going to leave, particularly for low tax nations, which tend to be, apart from being low tax nations, pretty uninhabitable and awful, which is probably why they need to incentivize people to move there using low tax regimes. And I think, it seems ironic to me always with these kinds of discussions that millionaires and billionaires, business owners often, will complain to, till the cows come home about workers threatening to strike over conditions that they don't like, are the ones who continually hold us over a barrel when we threaten to tax them, just as other developed, nations in Europe are doing. It's just absurd to me that they're allowed to make these threats, but workers, when they're put in conditions that they don't like, are totally unreasonable. And I think, just that kind of hypocrisy indicates the kind of desperation that these people, are feeling because they're threatened by, well, to be frank, quite an unlikely prospect from the sounds of it that Labour will introduce a wealth tax. But yeah, I think that this is where, when we're talking about the Green Party and this new party, wealth taxes should come in. They're rattled because they know that people really want them, not just people on the left, but conservative voters, centrist Labour voters, the public at large broadly supports taxes on wealth. And so that's why we see this kind of hysterical pushback against them using entirely unevidenced claims.